There is a moment in every life, human or animal, when everything you've ever felt, every scar you've ever carried, every promise you've ever made to someone you love, comes down to a single breath. This is the story of a horse that wouldn't run, and the man who needed him to. And what happened when the man hit the ground? Calvert, Texas, population 1,247. The kind of town where everybody knows your truck, your dog, and your grief. It was here, on a 38-acre spread just east of the Brazos River, that James Earl Whitfield lived the only life he'd ever wanted, and slowly, quietly began to lose it. James was 52 years old when this story begins. Lean in the way that hard labor makes a man lean, hands like saddle leather, eyes the color of a winter sky, gray, clear, and carrying weather inside them. He had a silver mustache he'd worn since his 30s, a preference for black coffee and silence in the mornings, and a reputation in Robertson County as the finest quarter horse trainer this side of the Brazos. His ranch was called Ironwood. The name came from the tree line that bordered the southern pasture, a row of old Texas ironwood trees, twisted and unyielding, that had stood through drought and flood and ice storm for over 100 years. James always said those trees were why he stayed. Something about their stubbornness made him feel at home. He'd trained horses for 30 years. He'd watched champions come out of ordinary animals. He'd seen horses with perfect bloodlines amount to nothing, and he'd seen horses that nobody wanted grow into something that made grown men cry in the stands. But he'd never had a horse like Dust Cloud. And before we get to Dust Cloud, before we get to the race that nearly killed one of them and forced the other to make a choice no one can explain, you need to understand what James had already been through. Because the story of why a horse refuses to run doesn't start in a starting gate. It starts in a hospital room 3 years earlier at 2:47 in the morning when James held his wife Margaret's hand and felt it go still. Margaret Alice Whitfield had been sick for 18 months, ovarian cancer. The kind that moves like a slow river. You almost don't notice the current until it's already taken you somewhere you can't come back from. She was the one who laughed first at everything, who put wildflowers in old mason jars on the kitchen table, who knew every horse on the property by their personality, not their bloodline, who would stand at the fence at dusk and just watch them breathe, like watching them was enough to fill whatever was empty inside her. When she died, James didn't cry at the funeral. His 2 sons, Danny, 26, and Cole, 23, stood beside him in dark suits that didn't fit them right, and they held him up without knowing that's what they were doing, and James stared at the casket like he was trying to memorize it. He went back to Ironwood that same night. He didn't eat, he didn't sleep, he went to the barn. He sat in the hay in the dark with the smell of horses all around him, that warm, living, ancient smell, and somewhere around 3 in the morning he started talking. Not praying, not crying, just talking to the darkness, to Margaret, to whoever listens when a man runs out of everything except words. He said, "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now." And the barn was quiet. And for 3 months, James Whitfield operated on muscle memory and black coffee, training horses he felt nothing for, billing clients he barely noticed, moving through his own life like a man walking through water. His sons called, he answered, but wasn't really there. His neighbor Carl Puentes brought over casseroles he didn't eat. His vet, Dr. Nora Hale, stopped by twice a week under the pretense of routine checks and really just watched him with worried eyes. James didn't want fixing, he wanted the weight of grief to mean something. He was afraid that if he felt better, it would mean Margaret mattered less. That's the kind of man James Whitfield was. And into this man's broken open life in late October of that same year, arrived a 2-year-old chestnut colt with a white blaze down his face and the most obstinate, infuriating, inexplicable personality James had ever encountered in 4 decades around horses. The screen fills with a livestock auction yard in Navasota, Texas, mud underfoot, the smell of animals and sawdust, a gray October morning. The auction was a claiming sale, the kind where horses that haven't made it or haven't yet get passed along, a recycling of ambition. James hadn't planned to buy anything. He'd come only because Carl had dragged him out of the house, insisting that sunlight and noise were medicine. The colt came in at lot 47. He was a registered quarter horse, American Quarter Horse Association papers, and a bloodline that should have made him valuable. His sire was a two-time champion sprinter out of Oklahoma. His dam had produced two decent barrel horses. On paper, he looked like potential. In person, he looked like trouble. He came into the ring fighting the lead rope. Not panicked, horses panic with wide eyes and white showing at the rim. This colt was something else. He was calm and uncooperative, the way a person is calm when they've already decided not to listen to you. He planted his feet and looked around the ring with an expression that James would later describe as deeply unimpressed. The bidding started low, stayed low. The colt had a record. 2 trainers had returned him in 6 months. One wrote in his report, refuses to break from a standing start, will not respond to conventional cueing, recommend against purchase for any competitive purpose. The other wrote simply, this horse doesn't want to run. Lot 47 was going for $800. James didn't raise his paddle. He watched. He noticed that the colt, in the middle of all the noise and chaos of the auction ring, had found something to focus on. He was watching a young woman in the stands who was eating a bag of corn chips and not paying attention. The colt was watching her with absolute focus, tracking her hand movements, completely tuned out from the handlers and the crowd and the bidding. James thought, that horse isn't broken, that horse is selective. There is a difference. He raised his paddle. Nobody argued. He paid $850 for lot 47 and walked him out into the gray October morning, and the colt went with him easily, not because he trusted James, but because he'd already decided the auction ring wasn't interesting anymore. On the trailer ride home, James sat in the cab and asked out loud to nobody, "What am I going to do with you?" The colt shifted his weight in the trailer. James named him Dust Cloud because of the way he moved across the dry Texas earth, not yet running, just walking, and leaving behind a haze of displaced ground that seemed to hang in the air longer than it should. Part 3: The Education of a Stubborn Horse. Dawn at Ironwood Ranch, frost on the fence rails. James in his barn coat, coffee in hand, watching the colt in the round pen. The first month was humbling. James had trained horses for 30 years. He'd gentled wild mustangs. He'd retrained barrel horses with bad habits and track horses with worse ones. He had a reputation built on patience and instinct, and Dust Cloud made him question both. The colt was not aggressive. He never kicked, never bit, never exhibited the kind of dangerous behavior that would have made the decision easy. He simply declined. You asked him to walk, he walked. You asked him to trot, he trotted. You asked him to canter, he cantered, eventually on his own schedule, as if he were granting a favor. You asked him to break from a standstill into a full sprint, the way a quarter horse must in competition, launching from still to fast in a burst of pure muscle and willingness, and Dust Cloud stood there and looked at you. James tried everything he knew. Different bits, different saddles, different ground approaches, different reinforcement patterns. He read, which was unusual for him, called a behavioral specialist in Lexington, Kentucky, who laughed politely and said some horses just aren't wired for the gait. He's wired, James said quietly. He's just waiting for a reason. He didn't know why he believed that, he just did. It was Margaret who had always talked about the emotional lives of horses. James had listened the way you listen to someone you love saying something you half believe, with affection and mild skepticism. She'd said once, leaning on the fence while watching a mare in her foal, "They feel everything, James, they just can't tell you about it, so they show you. Every time you're not getting through to a horse, you're not listening to what they're showing you." James had smiled and said something about instinct and training. Now, alone with Dust Cloud in the pre-dawn dark, he tried to listen. He stopped asking the colt to run. Instead, he just existed with him, morning after morning, sometimes with a lead rope, sometimes without. Sometimes talking about Margaret, about the ranch, about nothing in particular. The colt would stand nearby, ears moving, eyes half closed, that particular quality of horse attention that isn't looking at you but isn't not looking at you either. He groomed him every day, long, slow strokes that were more meditation than maintenance. He took him on long walks down the fence lines of Ironwood, through the ironwood trees at the south pasture border, into the shallow creek that crossed the eastern edge of the property. Dust Cloud liked the creek. He would stand in the slow-moving water and lower his head and just be still, and James would stand beside him, and there would be long minutes of complete quiet. In those minutes, something began to happen to James that he didn't have words for yet. The grief was still there, it would always be there, but it was changing shape. From a weight that pressed down on him to something more like a presence alongside him. Margaret, he thought, still here, different. A single clear memory, Margaret, young, laughing, running her hand down a horse's neck with complete unself-consciousness. On a cold November morning, 6 weeks after the auction, James was standing in the round pen, not asking anything, just present, when Dustcloud walked up behind him and pressed his nose against the back of James's neck. James went still. The horse breathed once, twice. The warm breath moved against the cold air. And then Dustcloud stepped back, looked at James for a long moment, and broke into a full gallop around the pen, exploding from stillness to speed in a single, perfect, electric instant, exactly what he'd been refusing to do for 6 months under 2 professional trainers. He ran 3 laps, stopped, looked at James. James stood in the middle of the pen with his hand over his mouth and tears running down his face in the freezing air. He didn't know if he was crying for the horse or for himself or for Margaret or for all 3. It didn't matter. Through the winter and into spring, James and Dustcloud built something that had no official name in the language of horse training. It wasn't just the bond between trainer and animal. It was something rarer, a mutual reliance. Dustcloud needed James to be present, to be fully there, to be the one person who didn't hurry him or demand from him. And James needed Dustcloud to have a reason to get up at 5 in the morning and walk out to the barn in the dark. They healed each other without meaning to. James's sons noticed. Danny came home for Easter and watched his father in the round pen with the chestnut colt, and afterward sat on the porch steps and said quietly, "Dad, I don't know what that horse is doing for you, but keep letting him do it." James handed him a beer and said nothing. They began competitive training in February. Light at first, short burst drills, gait work without the pressure of timing, building the muscle memory and the trust simultaneously. Dustcloud was athletic in a way that almost didn't seem fair. When he decided to run, he ran with a kind of clean ferocity that made James hold his breath. His acceleration off the line was what trainers called electric. His stride was long and low and ground-devouring. He was fast. He was potentially very, very fast. But he would only run when he was ready. James learned to read the signs, the way Dustcloud's ears would come forward, the slight change in his posture, the focusing of his attention. When those signs appeared, James would give the cue and Dustcloud would run. When those signs weren't there, asking was pointless. The horse would simply stand, patient and unmoved, until James stopped asking. It was maddening to anyone watching. Dr. Nora Hale came out in March to do a wellness check and ended up staying 2 hours watching the training session. Afterward, she said, "James, you understand that in a real race he doesn't get to decide when he's ready." "I know," James said. "So what's your plan?" James watched Dustcloud moving in the late afternoon light, that long chestnut body moving in easy circles, the white blaze catching the sun. He said, "He'll be ready when it counts, I believe that." Nora looked at him for a long moment. She was a practical woman, science and evidence and observable data. But she'd also known James Whitfield for 15 years, and she'd learned that his instincts about horses were a different kind of knowing. She said, "Okay." James entered Dustcloud in his first sanctioned competition in June, a local quarter horse sprint, nothing serious, 400 yards at a small track outside Brenham. He didn't tell many people about it. He drove the trailer himself at 5 in the morning, Dustcloud quiet in the back. At the track, the colt was examined and measured and placed. He went into the starting gate with his ears forward and his muscles coiled, and James stood at the rail with his hat in his hands and his heart somewhere in his throat. The gate opened. Dustcloud stood still for what felt like forever, but was actually 1 full second. Then he ran. He finished 4th. 4 horses had already launched and were a body length ahead by the time Dustcloud's hooves found their first stride. 4th place. Last, the announcer didn't even call his name. On the drive home, James talked to Dustcloud through the trailer window. That wasn't unusual by now. They both accepted it as normal. He said, I know you can do it. I saw you when you decided. I saw what you did in the pen. You know what you're capable of. The trailer swayed on the highway. The Texas sky went pink at the edges. James said, I'm not giving up on you. I need you to know that. And somehow, in the way that only happens between people, and sometimes between people and the creatures they love, it felt like the colt heard. Late summer, the quality of light changing. James at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that has gone cold. What James didn't know, what he had been working very hard not to know, was that his body was lying to him. He'd noticed the fatigue in spring, chalked it up to age, to grief, to the grinding physical work of a ranch in full operation. He noticed the shortness of breath in the heat of summer and decided it was the heat. He noticed the occasional tightening in his chest, like a hand squeezing, not hard, just reminding, and filed it away under I'll deal with that later. James Whitfield had spent his whole life dealing with things later. It was how men of his generation in this part of Texas were built. You did not stop, you did not complain, you did not let the machinery of your life grind to a halt because a gear felt worn. You kept going, you always kept going. Danny called in August and mentioned carefully that James's voice sounded different on the phone. James said it was allergies. Danny said, Dad, you've never had allergies in your life. James changed the subject. The night it became impossible to ignore was a Thursday in September. James was in the barn after sunset, doing evening rounds. He reached up to push open the high door of the feed room, a motion he'd done 10,000 times, and something happened in his chest like a door being slammed from the inside. The pain moved down his left arm. Not agony, not the movie version of a heart attack, more like a deep, insistent pressure that took his breath and made the world tilt. He sat down on the feed room floor, back against the wall, and breathed very carefully for 15 minutes until it passed. Then he got up and finished evening rounds. He did not call anyone, he did not drive to the hospital. He went inside, ate half a sandwich, and went to bed. The audience should feel the horror of this, the quiet self-neglect of a man who has forgotten to protect himself. In the morning, he was in the barn by 5 as always. Dustcloud watched him from the stall with those dark, deep eyes, that particular quality of attention, ears forward, head slightly tilted. James noticed the horse watching him and said, "Morning, big fella." Dustcloud didn't move. He just watched. James would remember this later, the way the horse watched him that morning, like he was studying something, calculating something, arriving at a conclusion. The county fair at Calvert was in 3 weeks. James had entered Dustcloud in the quarter horse sprint, a modest local competition, but one with history and pride behind it, and one where James had promised Carl Puentes a race worth watching. He didn't cancel the entry, he kept training. He took his blood pressure at the pharmacy in town and looked at the reading for a long time and then drove home and didn't call his doctor. The reading said 178/104. James put the paper in the glove compartment and drove home through the flat Texas evening and didn't say anything to anyone. He went to the barn, he put his forehead against Dustcloud's neck and stood there in the smell and the warmth and the darkness. Dustcloud turned his head slightly, not a nuzzle, not a pushing gesture, just a slow movement, and then he was still, just present, his big body a warm wall against the September night. James said nothing. This is the quiet before the break. It was the 3rd Saturday in October when Calvert came alive in the way it did every year, trailers and trucks filling the fairgrounds before dawn, horses being unloaded and walked and assessed by their owners with the kind of focus that makes strangers look out of place. James arrived at 5:45 in the morning. He looked older than he had in spring, thinner. His color wasn't right, a grayness under the tan that Dr. Nora Hale, who was there that morning with 2 clinic horses, noticed immediately. She pulled him aside near the registration tent and said, "James, when did you last see a doctor?" "I'm fine, Nora." "That's not what I asked." "I'm fine." She looked at him for a long moment, a doctor's look, the kind that measures things you haven't said. She said, "The race is at 2, you eat something real before then, you drink water, you sit down when you're not needed." "You sound like Margaret." A silence fell between them like a stone dropped in water. Nora said quietly. Maybe that's because Margaret would have made you go to the doctor months ago. James nodded once, put his hat on, and walked back toward the trailer. Mid-morning, the fair filling up, kids with cotton candy, old men in lawn chairs, the serious horse people gathered near the track with coffee and folded programs. The race card had 12 entries in the quarter horse sprint, 400 yards straight away, one shot at glory. The purse was modest, $1,200 and a ribbon and bragging rights in Robertson County. But the people who mattered were here, and winning here meant something beyond numbers. Dustcloud was in stall 6. He had been quiet all morning, not his distracted quiet, not his selective uninterested quiet, but a different stillness. Alert, present, he watched the movement of the fairground with his ears tracking every sound, but his body was composed in a way that James recognized as readiness. You feel it too, James said to him, running the curry comb along his flank in long, slow strokes. Cole had driven up from Austin the night before. He stood at the stall door watching his father work and said, Dad, he looks incredible. He's ready, James said. Are you? James looked up at his son, 24 years old now, same height as James, same winter sky eyes. He said, yeah. Cole looked at his father the way Danny had looked at him in spring, with that particular son fear, the fear of watching a parent diminish and not knowing what to do about it. He said, I want you to sit with me at the rail after he's saddled, okay? Just rest until the gate. Cole. Please, Dad. James agreed. Noon, the sun high and serious over central Texas, the fairground food smells and the crowd thickening along the track rail. James ate half a corn dog, drank 2 bottles of water, sat with Cole and Carl Puentes in fold-out chairs at the track rail and watched the earlier heats and felt the ordinary joy of a horse day, the specific pleasure of this world he'd lived in all his adult life, the smells and sounds and the beautiful, purposeful animals. He felt something else too, a tightness that had been building all morning, slow and insistent in the center of his chest. He breathed through it. He told himself it was nerves. He told himself it was normal. At 1:15, he got up to go saddle Dustcloud. He made it to the barn alley before his legs stopped working right. The tightening in his chest became something catastrophic, not a slam this time, but a spreading, a moving, a pressure so enormous and thorough that the world lost its edges. His left arm went numb from shoulder to fingertip. His vision tunneled. He reached for the barn wall and found it and held on for approximately 4 seconds. Then James Earl Whitfield hit the ground. Silence, the crowd noise far away, dust rising from the barn floor, a single beam of afternoon light through the slatted wall. He was conscious, barely. He could see the hay-covered ground close to his face. He could smell it, hay and earth and the ancient clean smell of horses. He could hear, distantly, the muffled PA system calling an earlier race. And closer, much closer, he could hear hooves. From inside his stall, Dustcloud had begun to move. This is the center of the story, the hinge point, the moment the title promised. Later, in the hospital, during the days of recovery, in the telling and retelling that this story would go through, no one could fully explain what happened next. Not James, not Cole, not the veterinarian or the track officials or the fair volunteers who witnessed it. You can apply logic. You can talk about horses' extraordinary sensitivity to changes in human scent, the chemical signals released by a body in physiological crisis. You can talk about the studies that show horses respond to human heart rate, to cortisol, to the micro changes in breathing that precede collapse. You can explain it all very carefully and precisely, and it will all be true. But none of that is the whole truth. The whole truth is what happened. Dustcloud was in a closed stall in the barn alley, 10 feet from where James fell. The stall door was a standard Dutch door, upper half open, lower half latched with a standard sliding bolt, a bolt that required a human hand with human dexterity to open. When James collapsed, Dustcloud began to move. Not panicking, not the chaos of a distressed horse. Purposeful. He put his head over the lower door and worked the bolt with his lips and nose in a way that horses do not do, that horses are not supposed to do, that this horse had never done before. He worked it for 90 seconds. The witnesses later counted from the video, and then the bolt moved and the lower door swung open. Dustcloud walked out of his stall and went to where James lay on the barn floor. He stood over him. Not on him, horses have an extraordinary awareness of their own hooves near fragile things. He stood beside James's collapsed form and put his head down and nudged him once gently at the shoulder. James made a small sound. Dustcloud raised his head and let out a sound, not a whinny, not a neigh, but a single sustained vocalization, high and carrying, the way a horse sounds when it is calling across distance. Cole heard it from the track rail. He told James later, "Dad, I've been around horses my whole life. I've never heard a horse make that sound. I knew, I don't know how I knew, but I knew." Cole ran. He found James in the barn alley and he found Dustcloud standing over him, and he pulled out his phone and called 911, and while he waited, he held his father's hand, and Dustcloud stood exactly where he was and did not move. Not when the paramedics came, not when the gurney was brought in, not when the equipment clattered and the voices rose in urgency. Dustcloud stood still in the barn alley, patient and enormous and present, until James was lifted and carried toward the ambulance. And then the horse walked slowly back to his open stall and stood in the doorway, watching the ambulance leave. The crowd sounds at the fair, an announcer calling a different race, the ordinary world continuing. St. Joseph Regional Health Center, Bryan, Texas, the quiet particular to hospital corridors. James had what the cardiologist called a significant cardiac event, a blockage in the left anterior descending artery, the one they call the widowmaker for its lethality when it goes wrong. He had been living with severe, undiagnosed coronary artery disease for, the doctor estimated, at least 2 years. 2 years of tightening, 2 years of the body sending signals that James Whitfield had filed under later. He survived. The surgery was 4.5 hours. He came out of it with a repaired artery and a new collection of prescriptions, and a cardiologist named Dr. Rashid who sat at his bedside the next morning and said, with the particular directness of a physician who does not have time for evasion, "Mr. Whitfield, if you had been alone when this happened, you would not be talking to me right now." James was quiet for a long time. He said, "I wasn't alone." Dr. Rashid asked who had been with him. James said, "My horse." The cardiologist blinked, then wrote something in his chart. Danny had driven through the night from Houston. Cole hadn't left the waiting room. Carl Puentes had brought a casserole to the hospital because it was the only thing he knew how to do. In the gray hospital light, James lay with wires attached to him and the sound of monitoring equipment as his company, and he thought about 2 things. He thought about Margaret, who had been sick for 18 months in a room like this one, who had been so tired and so unafraid, who had held his hand and said, "You have to take care of yourself when I'm gone, James. Promise me." He had promised. He had not kept the promise. And he thought about a horse in a barn in Calvert, Texas. A horse that nobody had wanted. A horse that had one job, to run, and had refused to run for 2 trainers in 6 months and a county fair. A horse that had worked a stall bolt with his lips and stood over a collapsed man and called for help with a sound that a grown man raised around horses had never heard before. He thought, "I still don't know what you are." And then, surprising himself, "Yes, I do. You're the one who was listening when I needed someone to listen." On the 3rd day, Cole brought his phone and showed James the video. Someone at the fair, a teenager with a phone who'd been walking through the barn alley, had captured 30 seconds of what happened. Not James collapsing, they'd arrived after, but Dustcloud standing over James, raising his head, making that sound. And then the response, Cole running, the paramedics. The video was 43 seconds long. James watched it once, then he handed the phone back to Cole and turned his face toward the window and was quiet for a very long time. Outside the window, the Texas sky was doing what Texas skis do in October, enormous and blue and going on forever. Cole said, "He's fine, Dad. Nora's been out to check on him every day." James nodded. "The race was canceled, obviously. I mean yours," the fair went on. James nodded again. Cole said gently, "You're going to be okay, you know." James said, "I know." Cole said, "Mom would have." "I know," James said, "I know she would have." A silence of the particular kind that sons and fathers share when they are both thinking about the same woman who is no longer alive. Cole said, "He stood there the whole time, Dad, until they took you. He didn't move." James closed his eyes. 6 weeks later, November, the ironwood trees at the south pasture losing their leaves, the cold coming in from the north in long, slow waves. The cardiologist had been specific: no strenuous activity for 8 weeks, no heavy lifting, short walks only, take the medication, follow the diet, come back in 6 weeks. James followed the rules with the same iron stubbornness with which he had once ignored the warnings his body had been sending him. He was not going to survive his own heart and then destroy himself through impatience. But he went to the barn. Every morning early he went to the barn, not to work, just to be there, just to stand with Dust Cloud in the cold morning dark, the horse's breath making clouds in the air, both of them quiet. Dust Cloud had changed in the weeks since the fair. Or perhaps, more precisely, James had changed in the way he perceived Dust Cloud. The horse seemed to him now impossibly knowing. Those dark eyes carried something he couldn't name. That stillness, which had once frustrated him, now seemed less like refusal and more like deliberateness, like a creature that had decided long ago to spend its energy only on things that mattered. One morning, 3 weeks after coming home from the hospital, James leaned against the stall wall and talked. He talked about Margaret. About the ways he'd failed her, not in the big obvious ways, but in the small accumulated ways a person fails someone when they're so busy being capable that they forget to be present. About the promise he hadn't kept. About grief and how it had become his default weather, his private climate. He talked about the fair, about falling, about waking up on the barn floor with a horse standing over him like something out of a dream. He said, "I don't know why you did that. I know what the vets will say, scent, instinct, stimulus response. But I don't believe it's that. I think you knew me. I think you knew what I was. I think somewhere along the way, while I was trying to figure out how to reach you, you were figuring out how to reach me." Dust Cloud's ears moved, forward, back, forward. James said, "I want to race you, not for me, not for the ribbon, for you, because I watched you run in that pen that morning when you'd finally decided, and I need the world to see what I saw. I need you to show them what you are." The horse looked at him. That long, particular, unreadable look. February, Texas in winter, cold and clear and merciless and beautiful. Dr. Rashid cleared James for supervised light physical activity at the 6-week check. James interpreted supervised light physical activity generously. By February, he was back in the round pen, moving carefully, working Dust Cloud from the ground, and feeling the particular aliveness of a man who has come close to not being alive and has discovered, on the other side of that closeness, that the world has texture and smell and light that he'd forgotten to notice. The horse was magnificent. That is the only word. In training through those cold February mornings, Dust Cloud was something transformed. He broke from standstills with that electric, breathtaking launch. He ran the 400 yards in practice times that made James go very still and count the seconds again. He ran as if the running were his idea, which, of course, it always had been. He ran, James began to understand, when he trusted where he was going. The Southwest Quarter Horse Championship at San Antonio, April, the big one. It was Danny who found the entry. He'd been following the quarter horse circuit since the fall, watching for something that felt right, and the Southwest Championship in San Antonio, a full-card quarter horse event with a legitimate field and a $1,600 purse for the sprint division, came up in March, and Danny called his father and said, "Dad, this is the one." James was quiet on the phone. Danny said, "He's ready, you know he's ready." "I know," James said. "And are you ready?" James looked out the kitchen window at the south pasture, the ironwood trees, the Brazos River visible in the distance, a silver thread through brown land, the place that had held his life for 30 years. He said, "Yeah, I am." The Southwest Quarter Horse Championship, the AT&T Center grounds, April in San Antonio, warm, already humid, the kind of air that makes Texas smell like it means it. They drove down the night before. James and Danny and Cole and Carl Puentes, who had insisted on coming and who sat in the passenger seat telling stories about Robertson County horse races from 30 years ago that nobody could verify but everyone enjoyed. Dust Cloud traveled well, as always, that particular composed quality, watching the highway through the trailer's ventilation windows with his ears forward, nodding the landscape, filing it under acceptable. At the grounds, James walked him under the lights, the big facility alive with horses and people, and the particular electric atmosphere of competition that James had known his whole life and had missed without realizing how much. Several trainers stopped to watch Dust Cloud move. One, a woman from Oklahoma with a gray braid and a clipboard, fell into step beside James and said, "Is that Ironwood Dust Cloud, the one with the unusual history?" Word had spread, as word does in the horse world. The story of the fair, of the horse that opened a stall and called for help, had moved through the community in the way that inexplicable true stories move. James said, "That's him." She watched the horse for a moment, then she said, "He doesn't look like a horse that doesn't want to run." "He never was," James said. Race morning, 6 a.m., due on everything. The ground's quieter than they'll be in 6 hours. James was in the barn with Dust Cloud at first light, just the two of them in the quiet. The world building itself up outside, voices and equipment and the arrival of horses from the overnight stalls, but in this stall, just this man and this horse. James put his hand on Dust Cloud's neck and felt the muscle and warmth of him. He thought about what he wanted to say and then realized he'd already said everything that needed saying, in a barn in Calvert, in a hospital room in Bryan, in 100 cold mornings in the round pen. Instead, he just stood there. Dust Cloud turned and touched his nose to James's sternum, right where, 6 months earlier, everything had gone wrong. A single, deliberate touch. James put his hand over it. The race, 1:30 in the afternoon. 7 entries in the quarter horse sprint, 400 yards. The grounds were full, not a national broadcast, not a national audience, but full in the way that matters, with people who understood what they were watching. The rail was lined. The announcer's voice carried through the warm April air. James stood at the rail with Danny and Cole on either side of him. Carl was 3 spots down, already talking to a stranger. Dr. Nora Hale had driven 3 hours to be there and stood at the far end of the rail in her baseball cap with her hands in her pockets. Dust Cloud went into the gate at stall 4. James watched him from the rail. The distance made the horse look smaller, beautiful and small and composed. The gate crew settled the other horses. The start official raised his flag. James's heart was beating. He could feel it, really feel it, in that particular way you feel your own heartbeat when you have recently been reminded what it means to have one. He said under his breath to no one and to everything, "Okay, big fella, show them." The flag came down. The gates opened. And for one terrible half-second, one eternal, suspended, unbreathable half-second, stall 4 did not move. The other 6 horses launched. The crowd made a sound, dust rose, hooves thundered in the April afternoon. Stall 4 was still. Danny said, "Dad." James said nothing, his hand on the rail, his heart in his throat. And then, the way a storm begins, the way a held breath releases, the way something waiting becomes something arriving. Dust Cloud ran. He launched from a standing start with an eruption of pure kinetic grace, not a horse catching up, not a horse overcoming a mistake, but a horse deciding with absolute certainty and full commitment to run. The other horses had a body length on him, then half a body, then nothing. At the 200-yard mark, he was even. At the 300-yard mark, he was ahead. He ran the way James had seen him run in the round pen on that cold November morning, 3 years ago, the way that had made James put his hand over his mouth in the freezing air. He ran like the running was his own idea, like the distance was personal, like he had been waiting his whole life for this specific 400 yards and he was going to do something with them. The crowd was on its feet. The announcer was saying something, his name, the race, the position, but the words dissolved into the general roar of a crowd watching something unexpected become inevitable. Dust Cloud crossed the finish line by a length and a half. He ran another 50 yards before he slowed, and then he slowed himself the way he always did, everything on his own terms in his own time, and turned his head back toward the rail. Toward James. Beat the world catching up with itself. Danny and Cole were making sounds that weren't words. Carl Puentes was hugging the stranger he'd been talking to. Nora Hale stood at her end of the rail with both hands over her mouth. James didn't move for a long moment. He stood at the rail with his hands in fists at his sides and his face turned toward a chestnut horse that was standing at the far end of a 400-yard straightaway, looking back at him. And then he walked onto the track. He walked the whole 400 yards. People watched. Nobody stopped him. He walked through the settling dust, past the other horses being collected by their handlers through the April afternoon light to where Dust Cloud stood. He put both hands on the horse's face. He looked at him. Dust Cloud was breathing hard, his coat steamed in the afternoon air, his dark eyes were calm. James said something that nobody was close enough to hear. He said, "Thank you for saving my life, both times." He pressed his forehead to the horse's forehead and stood there in the settling dust and the quiet that sometimes happens right after something extraordinary, when the world pauses to acknowledge what it has just witnessed. The ribbon was red, first place. James accepted it from a young woman in a cowboy hat and held it by his side and smiled, and it was the first full smile his sons had seen on his face since Margaret died. Ironwood Ranch, May. The ironwood trees in the south pasture fully leafed, deep green in the afternoon. James went back to see Dr. Rashid in April. He went because he'd promised himself he would, and because he'd promised Margaret he would take care of himself, and he intended to keep that promise from now on. The doctor reviewed his numbers and told him that his recovery was, in medical terms, remarkable. James thought about the word remarkable. He thought it probably covered a lot of ground. He entered Dust Cloud in 2 more races through the spring and summer. He won one and ran second in the other, finishing in a photo that was closer than the margin suggested. At both races, Dust Cloud left the gate at his own moment. At both races, the pause before the launch was part of the performance. Trainers began to ask James about his method. He didn't have a good answer. He said, "I stopped asking him to be fast. I started asking him what he was." People wrote it down in notebooks. James wasn't sure it made sense in any training manual, but it was the truest thing he knew. Cole came back to Calvert that summer and began helping with the ranch. Not because he had to, he'd been doing well in Austin, but because he said something had changed in him after the fair, after watching his father walk 400 yards down a track to a horse that had stood over him in a barn. He said, "I think I want to know this world. I want to understand what you understand." James looked at his younger son, Margaret's eyes in a different face, and said, "Then let's start in the morning." Danny visited with his wife and their new daughter in July. James held the baby, his first grandchild, in the barn while Dust Cloud watched from his stall with those dark evaluating eyes, and the baby slept against his chest in the horse smell and the morning quiet. He thought about Margaret, about what she would have said about this, about all of it. He could hear her so clearly sometimes in the specific way that grief eventually transforms into something like presence. He could hear her laugh. He could hear her saying, "Well, James, took you long enough." He smiled. Late evening, the Brazos River catching the last light, James at the south pasture fence. Dust Cloud nearby, not pressed against him, but close, the comfortable proximity of 2 beings who have long since stopped needing to explain themselves to each other. James had been thinking about what he would say if someone asked him what the story meant. He wasn't a man given to speeches or conclusions. He believed the world was too complicated for clean lessons. But there were things he knew now that he hadn't known before, and they felt worth saying somewhere, even if only out loud into the evening air over a Texas pasture. He knew that the things we refuse in ourselves, in the animals we work with, in the relationships we have, aren't always failures. Sometimes they're permissions waiting for the right moment. He knew that grief doesn't end, it changes. It becomes something you carry differently, with more practice, with less weight on any single side. He knew that the people and the creatures that save your life don't always announce it. Sometimes they do it quietly, with patience and presence over months and years, by simply refusing to let you disappear into yourself. He knew that a body is not just a machine, and a horse is not just an animal, and a life is not just the sum of its losses. And he knew in the deepest part of himself, in the place below words and explanations, that on a Thursday evening in September, a horse in a stall had felt something shift in the world and had made a choice. Dustcloud had refused to run, until the only running that mattered was the kind that saved a life. The last of the sun going down over the Brazos, the ironwood trees going dark, the ranch settling into the particular evening quiet of a place that has been through things and is still here. James put his hand on the fence rail. Dustcloud moved forward and touched his nose to James's palm and stood there breathing, slow and warm, in the cooling evening air. James said, "Good night, big fella." The horse breathed. The stars came out over Texas one by one. And Ironwood Ranch held its people and its horses and its grief and its love and its second chances in its 38 acres of river bottom land, the way places do when they have been asked to hold enough of a life to matter. Fade. Silence. One heartbeat. Then quiet. Ending message. Narration soft and direct over a still image of a horse and a man at a fence rail at dusk. Sometimes the ones who won't run aren't the ones who have given up. Sometimes they're the ones waiting for something worth running for. Sometimes a horse knows more about when to move than any trainer, any stopwatch, any starting gate can tell you. And sometimes the creature you're trying to save is the one who ends up saving you. James Whitfield is still at Ironwood Ranch in Calvert, Texas. He goes to the barn every morning at 5. He takes his medication. He calls his sons on Sundays. And Dustcloud, the horse that nobody wanted, the horse that refused to run, is in the south pasture, in the shade of the ironwood trees, moving through the world at his own pace. Exactly as it should be. End.